The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? This is the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. And as you can see, there have been some improvements made to the show. Lao Tzu and Brother Ogawa are two dedicated administrators here, along with a couple others that I'm going to introduce. So you can see we've made some improvements to the show. So welcome. This is the 72nd Dr. Oba Tashaka Show, and today's show is part 3 of a series on Black Power and its relationship to Black studies and the development of Africana studies. And welcome, Sister Robin. And the last show was Rules for Building Black Power in Alien Community, and not alien community, but alien university and community spaces. So this show is going to go into a deeper dimension of what we covered last week. Before getting into the show, I want to thank my team for the hard work that they've done to produce this show for the last year and 5 months. Brother Cinnabar has been doing technical assistance. He's the one that's key to this show being up. He puts out these professional advertisements every week, and I think you got one on last evening on today's show. I want to thank Brother Ogawa for his hard work. As I pointed out before, he's been taking my extensive presentations and cutting them into 3 and 4 minute clips. And he has a good eye for what to bring out. And so he's put them on Twitter and other platforms, including another YouTube platform that I mentioned before that brings in viewers for short clips of the show. And for the last 2 weeks, the rise in subscription has largely come from Twitter viewers, and that's his work. So I want to thank him for his hard work, and we're communicating regularly. So I'm getting a lot of input and ideas from him. And this is exactly what I hope for, the wise Afrocentric internet generation is hooking up with the elders. Hey. I want to thank Brother Lao Tzu for his work. He's been handling the chats and seeing that that's appropriately handled. And I want to give thanks today to Brother Lawrence Freelow. He's here right now. He's a former student of mine. He has an MBA with a master's degree in management of computer technology. He's a primary inspiration behind the book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by Choice Between Two Cultures. He's put a lot of his time and many hours and his technical skills in adding the screen piece that you see below, and in also doing other work, including the intro that you saw to the show that I used to use in the beginning, but we didn't have the technology at that point and the expertise to make this a permanent part of the show. And that took some doing in and of itself. So he put in many, many hours to make that happen. So I want to thank Brother Lawrence, who's here. Thanks, Lawrence. Before getting into the show, I have just very brief reference to some news items. One is a follow-up on what I've been following before, which is the effort of Republicans to gerrymander House seats designed to disproportionately affect their power. And the recent information that's coming out indicates that it's about even Steven. The Democrats have been doing it too. And except for a few toss-up states, it may well be even Steven or close to it. So there's a few toss-up states that will finally determine who has the best advantage at this gerrymandering, which is the way in which maps are drawn to bring into a map for one party people who vote that way, and a map for another party that brings in people who vote that way. So it appears that the Democrats have caught up, and there have been a few court rulings recently that also at least gone in their favor. So may not be the sweep, at least in terms based on gerrymandering of the House that people predicted, but given the way the economy is going, even though Biden's ratings have gone up due to the way he's handled this war and due to a State of the Union address, it remains to be seen. It still favors the Republicans because in outterm elections a year after a president or 2 years after a president's been in office, it tends to favor the opposition party. So we'll see. The other news item is that, and this is a follow-up on what I've covered before, that the Supreme Court hasn't had much to do with this, but Trump himself had interfered with the collection of the census in a way that was designed to downplay the numbers of brown, yellow, and black people and raise up proportionately the number of whites. And so I got a note from Ogawa on this, this is a continuation of what's been going on for a while, and this is part of the stand of those whites who want to maintain their power by falsifying it. And of course, the main way has been through stripping a lot of blacks of the right to vote, which I've covered before, through various kinds of maneuvers. So this is where it's at. And so this is part of what we have to fight against. So I have every show I consider special. I tell my wife I have a special show. She said, well, you said that last week. Well, each week I feel like it's something special. But this one is going into, I think, a very important area, because it's going to get into what really separates our culture, Afro-Centricity, generally the way we see the world, from the Aryan or European philosophical and worldview. And it has real meaning for the future of our people, future of this society, and the future for African people throughout the world. And I would say it has a lot to do with the betterment of humanity, because the culture and the worldview that we uphold is not only good for us, it's good for everybody else. So this is going to be a deep dive that I didn't expect to make when I prepared for the show. Did a lot of research, and then I found out I have to zero in on this particular point. And even then, I'm hitting a certain level of depth, but there's a whole lot more to this. But this is extremely important. So the topic for today is Afrocentricity, making the lower logical mind the servant of the higher mind. Now, this is extremely important, because it gets down to one of the fundamentals that we miss when we're looking at our culture. We often think that if we just have the information, that's enough. And while most of us are still getting the misinformation that writes us out of history, even when we get the right information, that can help, but that's not sufficient. There's some other things that has to happen. So that's what this show is going to take a deep dive into. And it's an extension of the subject last week that dealt with part 2, rules for building Black power in alien university and Black community spaces. Now you're going to see that I purposely held back on some stuff because it would require a long time to get into it, to the issue of spaces. There's more to spaces when it comes to the areas in which we exercise power that we need to control than we think. And we'll see what that is. So in the second show, I was covering new ground. I hope you get it, because this comes from experience. It doesn't come from any book. There's no book on this. By the way, it will be when I put this in a book, these shows. And so I was really thinking about, okay, how did we do this? One viewer, maybe a month ago, had asked that question when it came to the San Francisco Black Freedom Movement. How did you do it? And there wasn't enough time to really go into all of it, but that was a perceptive question. That indicated that they saw the value. I don't think a lot of people see the value. That we're the only movement in the country that whipped up a power structure, top to bottom. And we're talking about the economic power structure. Those are people that rule the country and rule the world. They're in decline, but they still have the power. They run the military. They play the biggest role in picking the presidency, because they provide the financing for it. And a lot of candidates come out of corporate connections. And if it's not presidents, it's people in Congress or people who are serving in various cabinet offices. And then they rotate back into the corporate world. So when I was discussing rules for building power in alien university and in our own Black community spaces, that was something that was going into looking at how do we actually do that, particularly in terms of Black studies. And so this is new because this is one of the few departments that actually accomplished this, and the only one that's revolutionary. Um, so in the last show, I made the point that it's important for our students' minds to have a chance to be free, that we own our intellectual and institutional space. Now you're going to see there's more to this space than that. But it's very important that we own it, meaning we control it, both not just the physical space of offices, which is what we normally think of as space, or in the community, the ground and the neighborhoods, but the ideas that run that space. That's real key. So in the second show, I was pointing out that you do this by transcending or rising above that space, those ideas, those philosophies, that curriculum that defines the Eurocentric one to the degree that it needs to be transcended. Of course, there's some things that you need, you know what I mean? There's some things in science you need. But as you'll see, not the philosophy of science. And if you're in medicine, yes, pre-med, there's some things you need. But again, there's more to healthcare than Western medicine understands, though we weren't teaching that. You know what I mean? But the point is, you transcend what needs to be transcended in the Aryan worldview, which is most of it. So the second show was focusing on that, and was also talking about how you efficiently manage your space by good administration, and how you defend your space by positioning yourself correctly. And the best way you position yourself is to stand on the truth. Don't defend anything that's embarrassing because it's false, and in other ways, ugly. Defend beauty. Now, battles might get ugly, but what you defend shouldn't. And if you're a good strategist, winning usually occurs through pretty strategy. Clean your enemy's clock and then get them to smile later. They don't like it, but later on, they are kind of, relieved that you didn't just take them through the ringer. You know what I mean? So today, once I started doing preparation for this show, I realized that I really need to go back and be clear on how I define power, and what that means. Because basically, if we're talking about controlling a space, it's through the exercise of power. And if we're defining what that space is, very often our definition of power is going to cover that. And I have to admit, I'm not the person who starts with a definition. I'm a strategist. So I start with ways to win and stuff like that. But over a period of time, you begin to get an idea of what it is you're wielding. And, you need to go into it in depth. And so I spent some time on that. And that really led me to reshape this show to deal with Afro-Centricity, making the logical mind the servant of the higher spirit mind. So in the last show, I dealt with Huey Newton's definition of power. And I want to stress that when I'm talking about power, while I was talking about the university space and the community, by community, I mean the African world. And I stressed this last week. Certainly your local community, that's your immediate base that you draw from, but everything's local in the world. So what we're also speaking to is the space that African people occupy globally. And so it's again, how do we wield power in those spaces? So the definition I'm going to put forward has application for all spaces. It's not limited to one. And while the university space is one that inspired this discussion, it transcends that and it's bigger than that. So last week, I went through Huey P. Newton's definition of power because I think that it's a brilliant definition, thought it then, thought it now. And especially brilliant given the age of the young man that formulated it. And some people have added to this, very often not giving credit for the source. They've embellished it. So I also began to rethink this thing more, his definition. And so to remind you, Huey P. Newton, Dr. Huey P. Newton's definition of power was this. He said, quote, "Power is the ability to define phenomena, and secondly, to make these phenomena act in a desired manner." And there's subtlety in that, you know, and there's wisdom in that. But as I began to think about this more, because I've always thought that, well, that was the best definition of power I had heard, I started to also see that there's some limitations and some omissions in this definition, and then some things that just come out of another cultural perspective, not our own. And this is not knocking Huey. At his age, to put this off, not bad at all. And the guy was brilliant, you know. So when I began to think about this definition, which is a definition that starts off defining or stating that power is the ability to define phenomenon, the first thing I could immediately see is that this is coming out of a particular worldview. Huey wouldn't be conscious of it, the young man he was then, and our people really hadn't and still haven't analyzed the Aryan or European worldview, so some wouldn't even know that this is an expression of the Aryan worldview. But essentially, to put the icing on the cake of your definition of power as being the ability to define phenomena is to miss something. The real essence of power is based on creativity. Defining some phenomena isn't the most important thing in the exercise of power. So it's a creative act that's involved in the creation of anything. And we're going to see how this works with us. So while defining is a part of it, I call it the bean counting phenomenon, which is what the Aryan view tends to do. It's good at calculating and it's good at counting and those kind of things. And a few are good at creativity, but their system is not creative. So a weakness here is that it didn't really put at the top of the list creativity. The second part of the definition, which is the ability to define phenomena and secondarily to make these phenomena act in a desired manner, that's profound because it's addressing the issue of phenomena, which can be anything, which is also smart that he used the term phenomena. That was good. And it suggests a subtlety in the exercise of power, because the making a phenomena act in a desired manner could be either voluntary or involuntary. And if someone is voluntarily acting on your exercise of power, that's a supreme exercise of power, you know? But the problem is, it is based on the assumption of domination. Now, of course, if you're in a battle, it's going to be a battle between two opposing forces. One's going to win, one's going to lose. So, of course, then in that situation, you want to be the dominant force. And you also want to be the one that didn't start it, unless it's a just war. So I'm not ruling that out completely. There are times where, of course, in the waging of war, your objective is to wage a just war and to win it. But as a general definition, that flows out of the Aryan or European or Euro-American worldview of control over. The Aryan ethos is as Lord and Master. That's the meaning of general Aryanism. That is the essence of what the European is, because that's a recent concept. European. Aryans, their root. And so being Lord and Master is their ethos. That's how they viewed their relationship to any other people, including their own, meaning other Aryans. They fought each other. That's one reason why Africa and Asia was able to break loose. That's one reason why slavery ended. When we came in at the balance of power, 170-odd thousand Black soldiers, we made the difference. We had the incentive to fight, and contrary to popular opinion, the skill. Best fighters on the planet, contrary to popular opinion. If you do your history, that would be no revelation. But the key thing is a definition of power that has as its second component the ability to make phenomena act in a desired manner, while it has its limits and its places where that certainly works. And I would say in the area of strategy, the highest level is where it works without a fight, where you win without a fight. The majority of my battles have been won without a fight. Now, there's ways to win without a fight that doesn't take great skill, and there are ways to win without a fight that take great skill. If you beat an opponent up of a group and then the others fall, that isn't really great strategy. It's good strategy, but it's not great strategy. But it's to win without any fight at all. That's the art. That's the real art. And then, of course, to capture your enemy's minds with them going along with it. That's been what the effect of Eurocentric miseducation has been on us. And that has been why Carter G. Woodson had his critique, which was quite valid. So the problem with this overall definition of power, if we're just going to apply it across the board and define it as making phenomena act in a desired manner, then this justifies, in the area of science, the control of nature. If you know anything about global warming, you should know that while coal and other carbons and others have caused global warming and the pollution of the atmosphere, and while those need to be cut out, it is the philosophy that drove the very move to exploit nature, which is the philosophy to control nature. And that philosophy rests on a number of assumptions that human beings are separate from nature. And in the Western view, which is heavily a materialistic view, then things are often viewed that way. But every realm of science confirms that that's false. We are the miniature universe and the larger. We're an extension of nature, and we're the children, and nature is our mother, and then the cosmos is the great mother. And so if we do damage to any of that, we're doing damage to ourselves. And so this notion of rule over and all the rest of this stuff, which is, of course, basically used as a rule over people, rule over black, brown, red, and yellow people, and wiping them out in many cases, that we obviously see what's wrong with that. But that comes from this Aryan Lord and Master mentality. And at its worst, it leads to genocide, it leads to slavery, it leads to colonialism. But at its very worst, it puts the planet on its endangered species list, which is where it's at now. So to save the planet, I did a show on this about a month ago where I talked about the spiritual blues and the philosophy of it and how that philosophy is a basis for saving the planet. You will have to shift more than just cutting back on carbon and other emissions to save the planet. You're going to have to change your mindset. You're going to have to change your relationship to the planet. And that means a change in the philosophy. And I would say we're at a point where the Aryan or European philosophy has reached a dead end. It never was good for the planet. It never was good for humanity. It's the only worldview that went across the world just wiping everything out in sight, everybody. The Caribbean, the native people, the Caribs, the Arawaks, and others, the Tasmanians, a host of others, Native Americans, 90%, they're usually left out. We'll talk about our reparation. Everybody will put it in a black-white binary, but fail to mention the worst crime, which is genocide. That's even worse than enslavement. And of course, we face both, with the millions of people lost in the Middle Passage and a significant number of them genocided in Africa. So I'm not putting Huey down. Huey's stuff is good. You hear me? And he's brilliant. But I'm saying that there's more to power than this. And in some cases, the definition that we have of power is culturally biased. And in the end, while it can produce some good results in one way, in a battle, for example, a just battle for liberation, in other ways, it leads us down the wrong path. So the other problem with this definition of power is that it describes what power does. It doesn't describe what power is. Now, this is extremely important. You hear me? What is power? This is real important. And you're going to be surprised. Some of you won't, but I think a lot of you will be surprised where it's located. Because you're going to expect me to come up with some discussion of technology, which is important. I mean, if they got it, you got to have it. You know what I mean? We can't go back to the bow and arrow stage, you know? And that's one reason why whites gained power in the world is that they were able to get some techniques, which is basically gunpowder translated into Gatling guns, the earlier version of the machine gun, cannons and stuff like that. That came from China, by the way. It should be a lesson for us when it comes to techniques. It doesn't matter who invented it, use it if it's for your advantage. But let your philosophy guide its use. And of course, your philosophy is going to speak to the preservation of your people and the upliftment of humanity. So it's one thing to define what power does. It's another thing to define what power is. And when you know what power is, what it really is, you have the fullest understanding of what power does in a comprehensive way. And you're going to find out in a minute, in a very personally empowering way. So the other weakness with this definition, I would say many others, is that it doesn't define the source and the nature of power. Still, Huey's definition is brilliant. And plenty of experienced older white military strategists that have laid out theirs and so forth. And Huey is better than that. So what does that show? We're some bad people. Huh? as in good, you know what I mean? So, what is the source and nature of power? What are its constituent elements? Let me get philosophical here. If you understand its definition, you'll appreciate it. One, when you see it, but more important, you'll appreciate its source. And when you really, understand its source, you're going to have a better appreciation of yourself. So, when discussing or putting forward a definition of power, one of the requirements is if it's accurate, it has to have universal meaning. So I know you all are looking for a definition that just applies to us. Guess what? Some of the most profound stuff applies to everybody. And we have our own culture, and our culture is so heavy because we've taken some of the greatest universals in the conceptions formed by human civilizations, and we've made them the fundamental, foundational, operational principles for our culture. And I'm talking about the African American. And then, of course, what about Kemet? What about the Yoruba? What about the Asante? What about African culture in general? Well, that's the case there also. Since we've been around the longest, that should be the case. So one of the requirements for an accurate definition of power is to be accurate, it has to have universal meaning. Applies to all people, but it has a specific reference point coming from your own culture. And what I'm going to show you is your culture firmly rests on this definition. And I'm talking about the new African or African American, the African in the diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, the African in Europe, and particularly the African on the continent. They all have these qualities, even though each culture has its own spinoff, its own particular set of historical experiences, and its own ethos, which is the way we carry ourselves in the world, what makes us unique. But generally, African cultures on the continent have a common cultural unity. And we share that in many ways, even though our ethos, the African American or New African ethos, is unique in the world because of the experiences we underwent here. So, for a definition of power to be accurate, then it must also apply to all areas: spiritual, personal, political, social, economic, military, science, all areas, the arts, all areas. One reason that it needs to cover all these areas is that it's people who wield power. And people wield power on different levels. So an accurate definition has to be holistic. And it must describe the source of that power. Where does that power come from? And that's real key. You understand? So what's this definition of power? Because, you put anything new before Black folks, they're going to say, oh, yeah, let's see what you got. And then some may have their own definition, so I'd like to really hear it. You know what I mean? So this is the definition I'm putting forward. Check this out. See what you think. Quoting myself here. Power is thought that creates who we are. Repeat that. Power is thought that creates who we are. And our highest creative thoughts uncover cosmic truths that make the complex simple, the abstract practical, and bring beauty where there is ugliness. So, okay, this definition of power locates power, first of all, in the person. And it is saying that at its fundamental level, it rests on thought. Power rests on thought, and it is this thought that creates who we are. And this is real important. It means you're an emanation of your thoughts. Of course, you're going to see this isn't the normal definition of thoughts. You'll see that in a minute. It's more than you think. And then there's a higher expression of power, and that isn't expressed by everyone. That's expressed by innovators, people who make breakthroughs and stuff in different areas of thought. These are the ones who uncover cosmic truths. And before their discovery, they're either unknown, the subject matter is, if anything's known about it, it's confusing. And so when these truths are uncovered, truths of the cosmos, then what those who make these breakthroughs are able to do is to take what was complex before and make it simple. To take what was flying over your head and you couldn't even see it or get it and make it practical. And this comes out of the New African context. This is what all our musicians, creators on every level, scientists, I don't care what level of creativity we're operating on, we generally say we're bringing beauty where there's ugliness, because our exercise of power in the Western Hemisphere was waged and continues to be waged in a world of ugliness, a world of racism, a world of poverty, a world of oppression. And yet our definition and our conception of power, and I would argue this definition captures what we've been doing as a people and what the best of humanity has been doing for a long time. But it has, in this particular case, a particular context for the African in America, bringing beauty where there is ugliness. The Kemite wouldn't say that because they didn't resurrect a culture out of oppression. We did. And so that has been one of our defining mantras. So the first thing about this definition of power is that it says that power is a creative act. The criticism I had of the previous definition, that it failed to incorporate creativity. I didn't put this in because the other definition failed to. I'm not reacting to Huey's definition or any other. I'm just looking at what is power. But I was comparing it to make some contrast. So this definition is saying that who we are is an expression and is a manifestation of our creative thoughts. Or if you are in the unfortunate position to be defined by others, then these can be the thoughts of others that shape you. And I should point out, in the sixfold stages to mental freedom, if you're frozen in the assimilation stage, then this is most likely to be your circumstance. The thoughts of others will shape and define you. And that's one of the worst things that can happen. And especially their oppressive thoughts, but generally we're here to create our own, to create and to add to the creation that God made. In fact, some of our greatest spiritual people say that in the beginning, when happening first happened, we as spirits were with God in creation, aiding God in creation. You know, now you can say, how do you prove that? Have you got a microscope that can show that? Do you have bone evidence? Do you have DNA evidence? This is before DNA. This is when we were spirits. You hear me? Someone said, please repeat the definition of power by Huey P. Newton. I'll go over that later. That would be on back in my presentation. So I'll do that when we're finished. So a definition of power that rests on creativity, in this case, our thoughts creating us, who we are, is one consistent with the notion that God resides within us, each human being. And one of the most important qualities of God is creativity. And so the human being, a manifestation of God, the Bombard would say, God's interlocutor, the one who God has communication with directly. And this is going to speak to part of what I mean by thought, that being, when they're drawing on creativity that resides in them, its highest level, the source is the God within you, which is the part of God that's within all of us. So this idea is central to Dogon thought. For them, the cosmos itself is a manifestation of God's thoughts. Think about that. I'm not saying you have to believe that, but think about that. That this whole universe, probably the multiple universes that have not yet been discovered, are creations of God's mind. And in Dogon thought, God is referred to in this sense as Ka-Amma, K-A-A-M-M-A, Ka-Amma. Amma being the name for God, Ka is your destiny. But in this particular case, Ka is your life force. And so this is suggesting that God's thoughts are life birthing thoughts through thinking, just as the embryo through the seed of the man is carried in the woman's womb. So thought, in this case, God's thought, is what precedes all material creation. Think about that. And so that's one reason why when spirit-bound people look at the skies, they see more than just blue, or gray, or whatever color it is. They see God, as you should see in every part of creation. So the point is, we are what we think. Our thoughts define us. I've always said, I know people who are the but people. I could do this, but because you put in the way of an aspiration, but it often stops you from doing it, because the thought that you couldn't is defining your approach to doing something. And so the approach to doing something is failure. Or there's a male shortage now in the Black community. That is, Black males who are on a certain level, they can match the sisters. And so there's a male shortage. A lot of them in prison, some have been shot, and so forth, right? And so in this context, we have sisters saying, and brothers do too, there ain't no good Black men around. There ain't no good Black women around. Well, that's far from the truth. But if that's what you think, you're going to end up either by yourself because you don't want to be, entrapped in a relationship that you think will be no good, male or female, or you will have opportunities right around you, good men and women that are even people who have things in common with you that you won't relate to because you can't see them, because as the way you think, so also is how you see. You know what I mean? Huh. And of course, that's what history has done. When someone else has defined you out of history, then instead of seeing greatness, we always see fault. Instead of seeing victory, we always see defeat. We can always find the negative. You put Biden in the White House, And then the most profound comment I can get from some black people is, he ain't no different from Trump. Oh, yes, he is. That's why the masses of blacks, and I always go with the masses on the essential things because the people are right. All right. That's why I joined the movement in 1960, because the people were right. They were standing up against oppression. I didn't come with no microscope. Who said Biden was our champion or who said he was loving? I'm not defending him. The point is, black people who are conscious, and that's most black people, could see where Trump was taking us. Not just to the doghouse. He was taking us to some hell you didn't want to see. But we'll say they're both the same. No, not quite. One was dependent on us to get in office and has demonstrated at least he recognized part of it, but he ain't recognized nearly enough. But the point is, at least you've exercised some power there. Power ain't perfect. It ain't absolute. This ain't going to get us freedom. But the point is, it's an exercise of power. But if you think it isn't, that's how you're going to see it. And people who say that, I know they ain't been involved in any fights at all. They're intellectualizing. Get into a fight and tell me there's no difference between winning and losing. Get into a fight and tell me that. So Carter G. Woodson was right when he observed that if we think we have contributed nothing to human history and nothing to humanity, and whites have contributed everything, then we'll operate under their direction. And there's a whole lot of blacks. I recall, I used to study under a woman who said she would rather eat crumbs at a white person's table than have their own table. I was going into Mexico years ago and was on border town in Mexico, and the guy there owned almost the whole town. The grocery store, the radio station, all kinds of different places. And so I asked him, because I want to hear what he said, because I thought that was cool, but I want to see what he said. I said, why'd you leave the United States? And this was his answer. I would rather be the head of a mouse than the tail of an elephant. You hear me? Huh? So he thought, so he was running something. He thought about running something, not just being somewhere, but running something. And I would suggest the most important thing you got to run everything else is run your own mind. But then we got to be clear about what do we mean about mind. We're going to get into that. So when Carter G. Woodson was saying that foretaught the same history, philosophy, whatnot of the European, then in his day, the Negro did not have to be told to go to the back seat. He would go voluntarily. And if there wasn't a back seat, he said he would carve one out to serve his, and I would add, subservient purposes. That's kind of like Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. He's not thinking very much, about heading anything. He's married to a conservative right-wing white woman, and she didn't seduce him to this position either. He already had it. That's why she went after him. You know what I mean? And of course, then she has undue influence, bedroom and otherwise. So Clarence Thomas is in a position to wield some power, but because someone else has got him to feel ashamed of himself, ashamed of his Geechee origins, ashamed of what used to be that South Carolina, but really African accent, which he's all but wiped out. He's on remote control and doesn't even know it. And he ain't conservative. He's the right of the right. You hear me? As backward as you can get, as anti-black as you could think, and he doesn't think so. But that's the way it is. So as you think, so you are. If you think you are nothing, you're going to behave like that. And that doesn't mean that you'll do nothing. It means that you'll do something subservient. It means that you'll be walking in somebody else's shadow. It means that you'll be a reflection of someone else's image. And when you pass from this earth, people say, And what did he do for his people? What did he do or her for humanity? And people have to scratch their head. Or as one of the posters of the Million Man March said, the man I just referred to should have never been born. That was a comment coming from an everyday brother or sister who knows darn well who represents their interests and who doesn't. So the reason that this show is entitled Afro-Centricity, making the lower logical mind the servant to the higher spirit mind, is because the key mission wherever we are, whether it's a university, the community, any part of the world we are, is to free the mind from psychological and colonial, and now neo-colonial, which is indirect economic control of societies, servitude. You know, it's freeing our minds from, and this is the key point for this discussion, from the despiritualized Aryan, European, or Euro-American mind, which many of us who are Afrocentric operate on and fear to depart from. I really want to stress that. And this is the root of the problem, the root of it, this despiritualized mind. So as long as we don't see that this despiritualized mind is a problem, we will think that African-centered information, African-based information, or for that matter, new African-American information that's solidly based on our culture is sufficient. And we will think that we have overcome the problems of miseducation through correct information. But as long as we're in a mindset where the intellect is separate from intuition, reason is separate from spirit, then we will see that we're in the standardized phase where we're thinking someone else's thoughts, even though we've got our own facts, because we're thinking it in their way. The way of memorizing information and repeating it. This is confusing the knowledge of facts with wisdom, the knowledge of facts and information with insight, the knowledge of facts and information with creativity. So when we place the higher spirit mind in charge of our thoughts, then we have the power to create who we are. So in talking about we are the product of our thoughts, we are especially the product of our higher thoughts. Those are the thoughts that should shape us because they're in conformity with who we are. Now, how do we know what the basis of these higher thoughts is, its source? One is it resides in our deepest wishes, our deepest dreams, our deepest desires that are for the good of others. But they're ones unique to us. I call those our personal truths. People who are able to live in pursuit of their wishes and their dreams are the freest people you know. And if you are in that space, you know that. They're also the happiest, because I know that a lot of us think that in the world of oppression, you can't possibly be happy. Guess what? When you have the free mind, when you're talking about the real free mind, you are free wherever you are. I know Black people that only feel free in Africa. I know some who have found their freedom in the Caribbean. I feel free wherever I am because my mind, body, and spirit is free. And everything else around me is a nice challenge. And that challenge puts high blood pressure and strokes and heart attacks on other people. It ain't going to affect me. You know what I mean? So when you're free on the inside, you're free on the outside. So when we're looking then at Afrocentricity, making the lower logical mind the servant of the higher spirit mind, then what we have to do is really reverse the order that we're living in right now, where the lower mind of reason, the mechanical mind, is in charge, and the higher spirit mind, intuitive mind, is pushed to the side, ignored when it gives us advice, and often regarded as superstitious. And so a lot of us act like, or want to act like, this is mumbo jumbo. This isn't real. That's why some of you had trouble with my shows on astrology. You still do, because it's been stuffed down your throat that this is mumbo jumbo. What other system tells you how your cosmos is aligned inside that's a miniature reflection of the larger one? When astrophysics tells us we're all miniature stardust, we're all miniature stars. So what system do you know tells you that? Astronomy doesn't, and it's a good system. I'm not knocking astronomy, but it's purely mechanical, despiritualized. But when you add the two, then you find out the energies that are tied into the material makeup of a planet. And it's inside of you, you know? So the real task when we're talking about power residing in thought is to be clear about which thought are you talking about. And so you got to be clear that it's the commanding thought, the leading thought, the powerful thought, the thought that comes from God that is within you, the spirit thought, baby. That is the thought that really shapes. And then when you give orders to that logical mind, then you can construct ideas, but it comes off of this big mind, of which we share a part. We don't have the whole. God has the big mind. If we can get a whole of a part, we're doing good. I mean, real good. And very often, we won't even get the whole of a part. We'll get as much of it as we can see and understand. So we'll be in a problem area as long as we think that we have your African information, but it's being digested in that despiritualized intellectual way in which spirit is not the force that enlightens us. If it's separate, then we're going to be good bean counters. We're going to be good at adding things up, but not creating anything new. So when we place the higher spirit mind in charge of our thoughts, then we have the power to create who we are. This power, as I said before, is seated in our innermost wishes and dreams. The essence of our innermost wishes and dreams lead us to our mission and purpose in life. Now, I did a series on God within, and one part of the series dealt with the C.O.R.E, or Chi, which is the destiny residing in each person. In the West, destiny is usually restricted to the great people who are supposed to shape the world. But we're all great. And the question is, what is our mission in serving as what the Bombara call guardians of Mother Nature and guardians of the cosmos? We have a choice to throw the cosmos out of balance, as humanity is doing, following a Western despiritualize mad science or to take part in restoring balance to the cosmos. And it begins by us understanding the power that resides inside of us and through our thoughts. And which thoughts? The commanding thoughts, the sacred thoughts, the high thoughts that are particularly tied to our truths. Our truths are those that speak to our mission and purpose in life. So our mission lead us to our true will. Now, there's a distinction here. There's willpower, which this lower logical mind can come up with, and that's tied to conquest, power, control, greed, all these other things. But it is, or can even be for something good, but it's forced will. You have to go at it. You have to really just do everything you possibly can to impose this will on yourself. That will is not the will that springs from our wishes and our inner truth or our inner purpose. This is forced effort. It's like the effort when your mama whips you and says, it's harder on me than you, which is pure bull. You know what I mean? And then you're going to do something because of that. Okay. I'm not saying that having some discipline imposed by parents is wrong. I am saying this whipping stuff needs to end. You know what I mean? We're carrying on slave behavior. Come up with some other ways to discipline people. But if that's forced on you, it's like Huey's definition of controlling phenomena. If it's involuntary action, in this case, it's will that goes against your real will, then that is not the will that we're talking about. If we want to understand how to identify our wishes, how to determine our destiny or our life purpose, we draw on the will inside of us that comes out of our most deep wishes, our innermost wishes, the one that we consider to be the dream thing in our life, that if we could do this, we'd be most happy. And here, don't confuse this with a job, the pursuit of money, though it might be, if that's your purpose, but it's your mission in life. And that's transcending everything else. That's what drives you. And always it's of service to others. That's the key. That's where the joy in life comes from, helping others. So when the will is an expression of these innermost wishes, then it leads us to our higher thought patterns, to these sacred thought patterns, because our missions in life are sacred. Missions formed in heaven in the presence of God. I know a lot of people don't believe this, but think about it, Think about it. And I've covered this in the God Within series. There is evidence that if you really want to look at it, it makes a lot of sense. The evidence is parapsychology, and this is the field where people who have experienced life after death say what that experience was. And a common experience shared by many people who have had the life after death thing where their heart stopped beating for a short period of time. They went to the light. They saw things in heaven. And remember, heaven's outside of space and time. So they can experience stuff in a millisecond that could take years on earth. And many have said they have witnessed spirits in heaven picking their destinies on earth in the presence of God, picking their parents. And some have seen that these spirits who are picking their parents are usually picking people or spirits, people in this case on earth, who had been friends of them in heaven. And they may have been the parents of those who are now going to be parents of them. But the point is, all of this is for a divine plan. The time you pick, the parents you pick, and in heaven, the strengths and weaknesses you pick. So this idea that we shape ourselves, our thoughts shape ourselves, it begins in heaven. But of course, I know a lot of you don't believe this. Check it out. I say the ultimate proof is when you go to the other side. It would be good if you could discover these truths now. And if you go inside your heart, you may find some evidence that will convince you, or do your own homework. So when we're talking about will, it's the roadway that we picked in heaven, that when we follow our wishes and begin to pursue, it becomes the consistent pattern of our lives. And that's the will that arises from your soul, arises from your heart, and leads you to your ka, which in Kemet means destiny, or Ori, O-R-I, which among the Yoruba mean destiny. In the Yoruba, each African system helps to gain clarity for another. So whereas the Kemites would talk about Ka in many profound ways, one of which is to say that it's your spirit double. Behind me, you'll see a black Kemetic set of figures. It's a S.A.R.E, and it's in his pre-dynastic crown, the ram crown, the white crown, meaning that he ruled both upper and lower pre-dynastic Kemet. And a pharaoh is facing him because he is like the father of Kemetic civilization and the first pharaoh. And behind that pharaoh is a being that has a white crown that is the same shape as the crown of the pharaoh, but it's white. It's telling you that it's dead. And it has two upright raised hands, which means double. And what this means is that the spirit standing behind the pharaoh is the spirit double. Parapsychologists call this the etheric double. They see the same thing. So I'm saying that you can confirm this if you want to go and study this deep stuff here about afterlife studies. You'll find all kinds of stuff. And they say the only difference between the etheric double and the physical being is, of course, it's a spirit. And it's outside of space and outside of time. It is also that part of you that is free of any affliction. It's perfect health. And it is your life force. But it is also that part of you that carries your mission and the record of everything you do on this earth. So it's interesting that parapsychologists would see, and they know nothing about Kemet, the same things the Kemites describe. So I'm just saying that check this stuff out. This ain't theory. Theory is a guess. You know. So power is the thought that creates who you are. And when it's truthful, it leads you, when you're following it, to follow your destiny path, your purpose in life, the place where the greatest rewards will be achieved. And in life, I always say there are two types of people. I've said this before when I covered this God Within series. There are two types of people on this question of destiny. Those that know their destiny, those that find out. And then there's a third type, those that never do. And there's a lot of people in that third area. Or they may have found it, but not realize that that's their destiny, because it's not distinctive like a Martin Luther King standing up as the great Black spokesperson for Black people. Yours may be being a father and a mother and the various things you do to improve life. And that's the most important mission anyone can have in life. But we may not see that as destiny, you know? So you are what you think. particularly when those thoughts are in alignment with your purpose. You can be that even when it's not, in which case you're in trouble. So just as thoughts create who we are, the highest creative thoughts of humanity enable us to better know ourselves through enabling us to know more about our connection to the cosmos. This is extremely important because we're all miniature universes within this larger cosmos. So our highest creative thoughts uncover cosmic truths that make the complex simple and the abstract practical. All innovations on the scientific, artistic, social, and economic plane come from the intuitive or spiritual insights growing out of knowledge. And all of them require a basic mastery of whatever areas that our gifts incline us towards. So if people are making breakthroughs in music or in art or in science, then they have to have a knowledge of that. It's not just that, oh, I'm just going to be able to think this and I'm going to be able to bring this into reality. No, there's work on that. There are a few prodigies who come in that know everything from beginning. The exceptions always prove the rules. Most of us aren't prodigies. 99% of us are not. And so most of us have to do the work, some hard, some less. As Dizzy Gillespie said, some of us are more gifted than others. A Charlie Parker didn't have to do a lot of practice. A Coltrane did. You know what I mean? And some of us who don't still do. Alicia Keys, she's got all kinds of talent, but she's got a hellified, disciplined approach to her music. So some know it, some discover it. My mother knew what her life purpose was. I discovered it. I didn't know mine. Who's going to grow up thinking about, I'm going to be leading some movements? You know, who raised their children saying, son, daughter, we're preparing you for war. Now, of course, if you're in that environment, yes, you know what I mean? And in some cases, some have. Nat Turner's parents could see that he had the mark of God on him and that he was going to lead a great cause. And they saw him as a Moses for his people, you know? So, yeah, some of us do have that insight. And sometimes you wonder, like Amilcar Cabral was named Amilcar after Hamilcar, who was the father of one of the greatest warriors in the history of the world. You know, a warrior called Hannibal that a lot of us have to question. Oh, he was black. Yeah, they wiped you out of so much of your history. He came from Africa. What else could he be? This is before the Arab occupation. A place called Carthage is now Tunisia. You know what I mean? So you wonder, did his father and mother have some inkling of who this baby was going to be? They gave him a master warrior's name, and that's one of the things he was. So, and by the way, your names are real important, you know? Your name should match your Ka or your Ori or your destiny, you know? They should match it. And if you're interested in an African name, get one that matches who you are, your creative essence. So at the highest level, the creative thoughts that are based on intuition or the sacred level of our consciousness, they're able to connect to the cosmos and bring out hidden knowledge, hidden truths. And this is beyond simply labeling something. This is knowing something, and it's knowing it in a very broad and a very profound way. And so all these great innovations in science and other areas have required both the technical knowledge, but have only come through intuition. The lower mind won't get you that knowledge because the lower mind sees in parts. It doesn't see in wholes. And whatever it tries to put together as wholes is going to be problematic. because it will probably catch some things that are right and get some things that are wrong. But if it gets enough out there that sounds good, you may fall for it. But because it's despiritualized, it's separate from spirit, it can't get the whole picture. And the thing that's really common about this higher mind, especially the one that draws on cosmic truths, is they don't only get holes of a part to a particular area of science or mathematics or music or art or social relationships, families, just societies. There's no holes in it. What you'll say about that true innovation has no error in it. The logical mind makes mistakes, but it's good. You need the logical mind for lower mind stuff. You know what I mean? Don't put the servant in your intellectual house in charge. Put the master, which is the one that is within us, that's around us, put that in charge. And when you've got that, you've got whole truths. So the transformation of the Black Studies discipline to Africana Studies is based on pushing the envelope of the discipline to the point where we transcended the Aryan or Euro-American or European intellectual mindset, which is limited to reason, that separates spirit from intuition, separates the secular from the sacred, and has a heavy emphasis on the material. In fact, the reason that most people go to higher education is just to get a job. They miss the point. True education is knowing yourself, and that's where real power comes from. I'm not saying you don't want to get a job, but maybe you might think about making some of your own. You know what I mean? But whatever you do, it's going to be based on insight, in which real wisdom and real power comes. So just as the discipline was transcending the space we were in, I'm going to say not all Afrocentric disciplines wanted to do this or tried to do this. Some did, ours did. It doesn't mean everyone in the department did. But the point is, just as that's what we had to do to create free space for our students to truly be empowered, through their own thoughts, then that is also what we were empowering them to do and our people to do. And a lot of our people have done it, and others need to link the spirit with reason, with spirit in charge. And so when we are able to do that, then we're able to adopt what I call cosmic logic, or the cosmic mind, which is whole. And we move away from the linear logic, which is based on the thought of a man named Descartes, in which everything follows a 1, 2, 3 pattern. People had to be told how to think. I refused to teach a course on critical thinking. I was forced to once, I pointed this out before, and I told my class, I'm going to teach this class by not teaching it. So I took them somewhere else. Because while you do need a understanding of your internal power to truly think, the notion of critical thinking in the university is just give people some information and then take them through some steps. And that's sufficient. And so you end up with people good at quoting other people, but not good at thinking for themselves. So this is real key. If we're going to create real free space, whether it's in a university, in the community, any communities that we have in the world, our nations, we have to create it inside ourselves, because that's how we manifest free thought, through free spirits, through drawing from, because the spirit is naturally free. The mind will be free when it's connected to the spirit that is free. So it's reordering thought and taking what has been put in charge, which is the servant, which is the despiritualized reasoning mind, and making it subordinate and raising up the higher mind. And this takes a lot of work, internal work. This isn't just something you read a book and you get it. It's like working in that garden, and uprooting weeds. It's easy to come along and come up with some pesticides that, kill weeds and also kill the chain of nature, including yourself. That again is an attack on nature. But it's another thing to go inside yourself and cultivate your own nature. Uproot the weeds inside yourself. That's the real work. And in this case, it's the weeds of despiritualization. So to free our minds from the separation of intuition and reason, it's really necessary that we return to the higher mind traditions, both African and New African. Now, this is a key point. Most Afrocentrists only deal with Africa. The New African, the African American, is left out. That's a big mistake. That's a big mistake because you are living in a specific reality, whatever part of the world you live in. You're an African in that space. And so the question is, how do you apply what comes from your rich past to the space that you're in, inside yourself and in the environment around you? How do you do that? And especially since in the African American and the African in the Caribbean and South America, the Western Hemisphere, we have the situation where either Africans brought Africa into those islands and dropped Africa into those islands because they were 98% of the population, or we had to rework it through an act of creative struggle to rework the fundamental principles of African culture into ourselves, which we still carried, but into the environment in which we lived. And so we have a continuation of African culture wherever we are in the world. And in some cases, we've improved on the African component. And of course, we have also brought garbage that has come from our oppression that we have to constantly work at overturning in our minds, our spirits, our bodies, and our lives, and in the societies in which we live in, and use to transform the realities in which we live. So to free our minds from the separation of intuition from reason, then we have to return to the higher mind traditions of both Africa and New Africa. African and African American cultural traditions, the positive aspects of them, and the highest. And they happen to be the same, by the way, though in certain respects, each one has an angle or a slant of their own. This requires a reconditioning of our thought patterns, of our philosophies, of our attitudes, of our communication, and of our actions. This is long-term work. Some of the stuff that I'm talking about here, I spent years working on myself on, and I'll share a little bit of it with you here. But this is internal work. This doesn't just come from reading a book and being able to quote something. You've got to have it inside yourself. So in embracing the best from our culture, when we look at ancient African culture, the very best is the notion of Ma'at, M-A-A-T. Most of us can run down its essence, which will say harmony, truth, justice, balance, right order. And then some of us will say reciprocity and propriety. Those were added by one of our scholars. That is not something that you will find in the Medu-Neter script. Karinga and I, we were, not Karinga, Dr. Theophil Obenga and I, we were sharing office space here when we hired him, 1998, I've referred to this before, for about 4 months, he stayed at my house. And so that's one of the questions I raised to him. I said, Avinga, reciprocity and propriety. I've never seen that in any of the texts coming out of Kemet. Now, he reads Meno Nectar. He said, that's right, it isn't. And I can tell you where propriety comes from, Confucianism. And reciprocity, you might define it differently, but it's a central term in Old Testament Christianity. And of course, we find it in other spiritual or philosophical traditions, but you don't specifically find it referred to in Meno Nectar literature. And this is important. So in putting the spirit in charge and subordinating this despiritualized, reasoning, intellectual, mechanical mind, putting it in second place where it should be, so it can follow the orders of the higher powers within ourselves, then it's important that we draw from the best of African and New African or African American culture. So a lot of us have the problem of being incarcerated in a European or Aryan mindset that is solely rational. And some of us, and I'm particularly talking about people who have been trained in higher education, have been taught to fear the spirit. And I could name names. I'm not. I don't get into this naming business. But some of us, even when we write a whole lot of stuff on Africa, the subject we leave out is spirit. We leave it out. Some of us will say religion every now and then. Remember, there's no word in any African language for religion. Religion means religio, bind together. That comes out of the Roman concept of Christianity and what they practiced before that Europeans call paganism, to insult people's spiritual beliefs. And religions have a number of characteristics. They have prophets, they have books, and they have laws. African spirit systems, Asian, Native American, they don't have those. Why? Because the basic truths reside inside of you. And so the 42 Confessions of Innocence are not laws. They're statements that I did not commit adultery. But it's not God giving down a law saying you should not have another man's wife. Why? You already know that. Do you need a law for that? You already know that. So these are truths that reside within. And so our problem in our incarceration in European or Aryan mindsets is that we embrace the rational. It's been stuffed down our throats so much that we're told that we're smart if we're just solely rational, that we fear the spirit, don't want to commune with it, and shut it off. And so we've imprisoned ourselves by buying into this idea that smart is solely being able to lay out some flashy ideas. And I'm not knocking reason. I'm knocking reason separate from intuition. So the despiritualized mind is good at separating ideas, separating things. It's not good at synthetic thought, bringing things together. This is because when you subordinate the reasoning mind to intuition, you will be able to bring in this synthetic. But when you separate the reasoning mind, then what you have is logic that is hierarchical. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. So you've got to think that way. Or history is put into ancient, medieval, and modern. Guess what? Those are describing what Europeans consider to be their history. But the notion of ancient would be recent for us. And medieval, most of Africa didn't go through. And modern, what is that? You know? But it's a sequential thought that doesn't fit your history. But it is also a sequential thought system that locks your mind down to steps for thinking rather than going inside yourself and coming up with your own answers. So, too many of us are imprisoned in either the Cartesian mindset, which is Descartes, or the Platonic mindset, and one has influenced the other. Plato influenced Descartes. And Plato's mindset is dichotomies or separations, separating good from bad. And so we will too often end up saying, this is no good, this is good, this is bad. Or we'll say, which is better? You know? And sometimes that may be a valid question, but the point is it's usually based on a good-bad thought system. Everything in life is a mixture, you know? A mixture of good and bad, positive and negative, inclining more towards one than the other. And so when you capture only one, you have captured only one side of any question. And it also means it leads to us being imbalanced in our thinking and therefore imbalanced in our actions. So the Kemetic idea of Ma'at, instead of being singular, is all embracing. Ma'at is the foundation of Kemetic, and I would say of all African philosophies. And it is based on oneness or unicity. So it embraces everything. It's an all-encompassing idea, meaning Ma'at is everywhere. And Ma'at is an energy or a spirit first that is invisible, that the Kemites say is the rudder of heaven, the beam of earth. You can't see it. King would quote from one of his European thinkers and say that the universe inclines towards justice, you know? Yeah. In fact, it's based on justice. He would say incline because the planet is out of balance due to the injustice prevailing over justice, the rich prevailing over the poor, the whites sticking it to blacks and people of color, and many whites having it stuck to them, but white-itis clouds their views. They think free white, 21 or more. And you can't eat that. And some people are having trouble eating now, and they're white. So one of the real powers of Ma'at is its all-embracing nature. It directs heaven invisibly. It's described as being the beam of earth. It's the center point. It's what holds it up, sustains it. It's the foundation for government. And when it's observed, just government. It's a foundation for just societies, free of poverty, which we had for a long time. It's a basis for the absence of isfet, what the Kemites call isfet, or disorder or wrongdoing. And we'll always have some. But the question is, what predominates? And in hunter-gatherer societies, there was very little of that because of the balance that they maintained for over 100,000 years. So Ma'at provides the overall higher mind thought pattern for providing balance in our families, among our males and females, and in society at large. It especially governs ethics, which requires us, before we can do truth, to think truth. And since this definition of power is based on we are our thoughts, the most profound thoughts are those based on the deepest truths. And generally, if we are going to lead good lives, we're trying to follow the truth. And the most important thing in life is discovering it and trying to pursue it and not to obey it once we get on the truthful path of life. So thinking the truth is the basis for speaking and doing the truth. So just as our thoughts shape who we are, and it's the higher mind thoughts, it's the doing of this that is the major thing, because we know through being. There's a saying that the Europeans had, Socrates and others who were philosophers, they said they were lovers of wisdom. The Ghanaians say, the Akans say, a philosopher is one who's wise. Of course, they love wisdom, but the main thing is they're wise. And there's a process for becoming wise. And one part of it is through thinking the truth. We have to know it and then think it. And then that's the basis for us speaking it and being it. So our thoughts, in this case, are just thoughts. When we're aligned with them, they really create the higher self. When we think the truth, then we cultivate our inner capacity to be the truth. So in African thought, and this is the book I'm working on now on C.O.R.E, which is pedagogy, or how you teach or how you learn, you know the truth by being the truth. And so therefore, learning is a much more difficult process than just simply the knowing, which is the factual consuming of information and repeating it. The knowing, that is the being of what is known, the truths that are known, requires a lot of work in internalizing the truths and cultivating that garden, discarding those falsehoods that we may believe or that we may live by. When we separate spirit from the intellect, we separate knowing from being. You hear me? Because it's through the spirit that we're able to be the truth. That's one reason why Western pedagogy doesn't know how to teach the mind and body, because they've excluded spirit. And so all they can do is get to that one dimension of the mind, the reasoning, counting dimension. And so if you separate intuition from reason, knowing from being, then you're in the forked tongue situation that Native Americans use to describe white people, where they say they speak with forked tongue. They say one thing and they do another. And some Blacks can espouse fake Afro-Centricity when our minds operate purely on the despiritualized intellectual plane, where spirit is separate from reason, where quoting excludes knowing. We become experts at quoting what others have to say and not being able to put forward ideas of our own. When we condition our thoughts to ma'at, to truth, which is its essence, we're centering our thoughts on what's eternal. And its highest level, profound eternal truths that are breakthrough truths that we call innovative. Wisdom is achieved in this way. African masters describe wisdom as the light that resides within each of us. And so that light is this higher mind. I see a James Pooh there. Yeah, some good information. We'll get into this in a minute. So the move from Black studies to African-centered studies was a double take, where we took the best from Africa and the best from Afro-America and African diaspora to expand our intellectual and higher mind envelope, to transcend this dichotomized mindset. And so this was the key to shifting the tradition. And I'll just say it straight. I won't go into the details because this one is just dealing with this higher mind. But the main thing that radicalized our discipline shift was, and most heads of departments wouldn't touch this, and some have told us, you couldn't do it. Well, we did it. Is whereas in the Black studies stage, it was centered on history, and history is still important. After we discovered how our thoughts had shifted, how our engagement in the community had transformed us, how different people had approached scholarship, how people in the community were approaching trying to pull Black communities back together. Given the circumstance of communities being attacked and us being put in the position of choosing between two cultures, we concluded, first, this was my conclusion and the faculty agreed with me, and Wade Nobles was the main one that supported this, that philosophy, African and New African philosophy, would be the driving motor for the discipline. Why? Because it's our deepest thought, resting on this higher mind. Why? Because you really can't understand your history unless you understand the deep thought, the culture out of which it arises. History's second, philosophy is first, but it comes out of a historical context, so you have to know the historical context. So, but in saying that philosophy drove the discipline, then I knew what that meant. Spirit drives the discipline. Spirit, baby. You hear me? And it's when you begin to push the envelope to spirit that you're also pushing the discipline, or when you understand that the highest thing you have to draw from inside yourself is spirit, you're pushing your own envelope to its highest level of freedom when you understand that is what guides you. That also enabled us to then put forward a philosophy of science that enabled us to teach chemistry, biology, and physics. And even hired a guy who had a PhD in chemistry from the University of Chicago. I did it purposely. He wasn't trained in this, but he went along with this philosophical shift so we could justify teaching these courses. But we got these courses through because you can't normally teach science in a behavioral and social science department or humanities department. You can't. But I did it by spookifying it. I told them the truth. Ours is a spirit science. That thing you call waves and particles, that's energy. That's spirit. So we enabled us to drop into the discipline of philosophy and an introduction to the sciences, which for students who wanted to go into this area in depth of physics or chemistry or biology or whatever, they could use to help save the planet. You hear me? What do you think of that? That was radical, but I've told some of my African-centered scholarly friends and they think we were crazy, but actually we succeeded. You know what I mean? crazy my butt. You're afraid of spirit. That's why you say that. So fake Afrocentrism is where we're using the same despiritualized reasoning mind as the Aryan, and we think it's African. And then we remove the spirit from our historical accounts, whether it's of philosophy, or usually they'll leave philosophy out, or history or politics or anything else. You know what I mean? And so if you leave the spirit out, you leave the African out. So this was like key in the shift of the discipline from Black studies to Africana studies. One of the faculty members, Dewey Crumpler, who's a mural artist and one of the best mural artists in the world, when we were in a battle with the Hoover Institute trying to wipe us out, and we were pushing for this discipline shift, he came in real enthusiastic. And he said, we're taking the discipline from infancy to adulthood. I had to quote him. And he was right. And he is a African-American mural artist who has a strong Dogon orientation, and gave me a very spiritually rich Dogon Numo twin statue when I was writing the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. So this shift to Africana studies represented maturing of the discipline designed to provide medicine that can help in healing a lot of the breaks of families, extended family communities, and the destruction of a lot of Black communities, the imprisonment of not only the bodies, but of the minds of too many of our people under a deindustrialized system where poverty is made normal throughout the society and Blacks are put on the bottom. This was like key. This was key in terms of expanding our envelope so that we could say this space wasn't just intellectual space, it's spirit space. It's political, it's social, it's economic, it's all of that. But it's especially a spirit space that is infused in every part of what we're teaching and a part of what we're doing. So when we draw from the new African or African American tradition, we have to look at what's the deepest aspect of that tradition. And of course, the deepest aspect is spirit. The most common thing a Black person is going to say is, the spirit told me. I'm sitting up in a salon, where I'm getting some work done on my feet, and the sisters around saying, baby, today the spirit told me. I say it at least 3 or 4 times every day. The spirit told me this. The spirit told me that. You know what I mean? We're a spirit-grounded culture, though some of us are becoming rapidly despiritualized, materialized, placing money before everything else. God is becoming the money. But for most of us, spirit still reigns supreme. In the midnight of enslavement, who did our people go to on the plantations to get a sense of our future? Diviners, who were African priests. You had 1 or 2 on almost every plantation, and Du Bois described them as the natural leaders of the enslaved. But who was the first entity that Africans went to? In hush harbors, they put their heads under a pot and drew on the spirit inside of themselves. And that's the core to what becomes the Black church, not during enslavement, because most of us weren't Christians then, but after. Spirit is at our core. You don't have a movement that gets off the ground in most cases that doesn't have a spirit component to it. My good teacher, Julian Richardson, who co-owned Marcus Bookstore with his wife, Julian Richardson, and was my teacher, Wade Nobles and Asa Hilliard, He said, you can't get black people to move unless they do two things: tap their feet and think. In other words, there's got to be some spirit in it, and there's got to be some good reason in it. You better have, some good ideas. But generally, most of our leaders have had both this spirit connection and this political connection. You hear me? Nat Turner's rebellion was inspired by the spirit. The dreams, then seeing blood on the leaves. And finally, after a whole number of spiritual events, it convinced him that he had to lead this uprising against terrible odds. I mean, terrible, Spirit, you hear me? Or Denmark Vesey, the best planned slave rebellion of all of them, based on the best system of organizing, the cell system. Well, they had thousands of members, and they didn't give up hardly any of them when they got caught. Central leaders to it was Gula Jack, an Angola priest, and Denmark Vesey, who was drawn from certain religious tenets that come out of Christianity, but it was, liberationists and also other political justifications. So, and if you look at the Haitian Revolution, what drove it? Bookman, a voodoo priest. The effort prior to the general uprising to poison all the whites, led by a man named Mackandal, who was also voodoo priest. Toussaint himself was into voodoo, though he was also a Christian and had some problems with political assimilation. But he was also described as one of the highest practitioners of voodoo, a person who specialized in plants and healing people, and had an aversion to death. And he was the greatest of the strategists. I think that Dessalines was the one who was the most solid in their political orientation. But again, spirit. You hear me? It is the sine qua non of African culture. Spirit is first. The civilizations of ancient and traditional Africa are all spirit-based throughout. Just as a Western culture is material throughout, the African is spirit in charge of the material, in charge of the political, in charge of the social and the economic, in charge of the military. So when we're drawing from the essence, the best of the African and New African tradition, both rest on spirit. And in the case of the New African, it has been a salvation as it has for Africa. One of the example I give is reading a slave narrative, and a brother, this was after slavery, but he had been enslaved before. He gives an account where he has a dream. And in his dream, he sees the Klan coming. So he brought together all of his black friends, and they brought their rifles. Now, this is after the Civil War. These guys could shoot. They could shoot before, but afterwards, they were real good shots. And when the Klan came, they had to spookify it out, with all of their little drapes and everything else. Gunpowder spooked them out. But it was spirit power that saved their lives. And so the wife of this man who had the dream, she said, but for his dream, we'd all been dead. Those Ku Kluxers would have killed all of us. Prayer is good, but praise the Lord and pass some ammunition of some kind. And in this case, if your life is being threatened by someone who's going to put a hole in you, have a way to defend yourself. And spirit enables you to do that. Spirit ain't separate from everything else you do. You know what I mean? And some of my victories, like at San Francisco State, the victory we had there, a 2-year battle, in the end, it was sealed by some stuff that my Babalao did after 2 years. I won't go into that, but he did some stuff. But he didn't win the battle. But he just helped us to kind of conclude it at a certain time. You know what I mean? So the political needs some spiritual in it. You hear me? And in fact, without it, it ain't going to be righteous. So the African in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere brought to the Americas a sacred secular mind and spirit, God and humanity, reason and intuition tradition that was planted into the soil through the souls of the people who carried it. For the people in the Caribbean and South America, particularly the Caribbean, where they were 98% African, they just dropped those traditions there. Here, we had to struggle to continue them, to reinvent them, to strengthen them. But the solid base was the spirit, the transcending spirit, the belief that God was within all of us and around us. So the spiritual blues tradition, which I've discussed before, but here I want to discuss it in a different context, represents the high point of this culture because the art form is the highest expression of your culture. Euro-Americans have no art form created in this country. Theirs is an import, and it's an oppressive import coming from Europe. The African in America created an art form in part because while we brought a culture that had to be rearranged and that we had to fight to recreate because every effort was made to destroy it, because of that, we created a culture that got rooted here. And as a result, we could create an art form that came out of that. In the Caribbean, that's a continuation of African cultures. The art form is. Ours is a new African expression. And it is, at its foundation, the most beautiful. And that foundation has inspired its peak, which in our art form, because of the way in which drums were outlawed, jazz is the highest expression of this new African cultural art form. But its greatest beauty comes from the blues, and the greatest beauty of the blues comes from the spiritual blues. Most people wouldn't call the spirituals the blues, but that's what they really were. Because the messages of the spirituals were more about everyday life than they were about the afterlife. They were more about freedom coded in various songs and terms. And they spoke to the spirit of freedom because that's what they were all about. The mantra of the spiritual blues is in the song, "Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave, going home to my Lord to be free." Meaning, if you look at the soul of the enslaved African, it was a free soul. There was an effort to beat Africa out of them, to beat humanity out of them. But the fact of the matter is, they came out of enslavement with their humanity intact, scarred with issues, but a humane people. The proof of that is that all we had was each other, and we survived off of each other. We had 2 nickels to rub together. We were able to rub something together that would feed our people, that would take care of the orphans, and look after our families, and build institutions. But it came out of this new African spirit mindset, and its highest point, the spiritual blues, which is the foundation for the art form. All aspects of the art form rest on this foundation. And its most characteristic quality is its magnificent beauty. And it infuses this beauty throughout all aspects of the African American or New African art form. Now, when I use the term spiritual blues, a lot of people would think that you would need an Afrocentric psychiatrist to explain that, because how can it be the spirituals and the blues? And also, people would say the blues came after the spirituals, so you could get technical about that. But the spirituals are the blues because when we use cosmic logic rather than despiritualized white logic, we are leading to a logic that is whole and not separate. And so in the spiritual blues logic, like the logic of Ma'at, spirit is in everything. And this is the key to the spiritual blues. It's in a stone, it's in a tree, it's in a blade of grass, it's in within every human being, it's throughout the cosmos. So because human beings, and in this case, enslaved African humanity, found themselves in an alien, despiritualized, evil world, our greatest weapon was this hip side of this culture that the spiritual blues and all the aspects of the culture represent. And this hipness comes from a word that comes from the Wolof people, and that word is hippie cat, meaning seeing from all sides. And it's interesting that the hip hoppers would take this term to define their art form. And seeing from all sides is also Ma'at, because Ma'at is all embracing. It encompasses everything. And so the hip person is extremely wise because they can see from every angle. And of course, no one can, but we're trying to. And so the spiritual blues reflected a twin mentality. You know, this is real key, as opposed to the linear logic mentality that separates reason from intuition. The spiritual blues is a mixture of two contradictory feelings: sadness or sorrow, and ecstasy or joy. And how these two could exist, especially ecstasy, in a place that was as dismal and ugly as you could conceive, could only be explained when you understand that the African in America, like everywhere else, but here, was going into their soul and bringing up music. As one enslaved Africans said, we think of something Africa and we create it on the spur of the moment. And we know the characteristic feature of new African culture is improvisation and innovation. I've said this before and you already know it. The one thing Blacks don't like to do here is do the same thing twice. We always like to change it up. You know, a mantra in African American culture is, I would rather be the worst innovator than the best imitator. Imitation is something we despise, though imitation is necessary at the foundation of mastery. Just as the child or the baby imitates the mother at the first stage of mastery, the novice imitates the master. But it is for the purpose of them finding their own voice. And a good master, sooner or later, will tell the novice when they've got enough together, now go on and do your own thing. They will encourage them to do that because they're encouraging them to pursue their own car or their own destiny by creating their own unique voice. So the spiritual blues, the most beautiful thing is its sound. And it's a mixed sound, a mixture of agony and joy, mixed. And it creates this contradictory feeling, but it inclines upward. It inclines towards transcendence. It inclines towards rising above the mud and changing your condition. The spiritual blues nor the blues are associated with suicide. Country music is, and by the way, country music is Southern whites' expression of their blues. They took the sound, I call it the sound of a barnyard chicken, but it's pretty. But it's sad. And that's why, because it's singular, it can lead some whites to wallow in it, and it can be associated with suicide. You never heard of no spiritual blues or blues being associated with suicide. In fact, our art form is one of our greatest healers, all forms of it. One of our greatest healers, because it takes us to the higher plane, because it nurtures the God within, the beauty within, the light within, the joy within, the creativity that's within. So the spiritual blues nourished as our people to persist in conditions in which we should have just given up. We should have come out of broken people. And some of us think we did, but the evidence certainly doesn't support that. And it encouraged the courage of our people to resist. So the knowledge that God was inside of us gave us the greatest sense of power when we're going up against a system that, unlike the Caribbean, numerically outnumbered us, though in places like South Carolina and Mississippi, we had the numbers in most of those cases. But in those states could draw on the other states to bring their violent power in. So we were in a different situation in that this was becoming a settler colony that was successful. As in the Caribbean, they had wiped out the Native Americans largely over time. But here, unlike the Caribbean, the whites settled in larger and larger numbers. So our creation of culture was both a necessity under these circumstances and a difficulty. And it required the central quality of what I define as power, creativity. The African in America is, in essence, a creative being. It's a necessity. It's not because we were any more creative coming here than anybody else. We came from the same people. Necessity required that. And it's a beautiful thing that came out of necessity. So New African culture then is the synthesis of Central African principles of the culture with the spirit as the top principle. And spirit is what, more than anything, has made us resilient, made us believe that no matter how bad things are, they could get better. The key thing is the spiritual blues rest on a twin mindset. And it is this twin mindset that is really the basis for transcending this despiritualized linear mindset. And so what is that twin mindset? And that's a mindset coming out of Africa, but adapted to this reality. The sacred and the secular, the blues and the spirituals, good and bad, joy and sorrow, they're twin. They're regarded as twin forces in our culture. So the great writer, Lerone Bennett, in his greatest work, Negro Mood, he described this as the blues mystique, where the blues are the spirituals, good is bad, God is the devil, and every day is Saturday. Now, a lot of Blacks would say every day is Sunday because of the spiritual thing. But the key point is that if you look at that, the spiritual blues tradition is a tradition where the political is spiritual, where Du Bois is Garvey. If you look at the end of Du Bois, he ends up in Africa doing things that Garvey made every attempt to do. King is Malcolm, and reform is revolution if it's pushed far enough. Twinness is at the heart of the psyche of the new African. A smile often doesn't mean you're happy, and a song doesn't always mean that you're entertaining, because this is a contradictory culture, which is what makes it brilliant. It's the most complex culture in this country and one of the most complex in the world. And it's a shame that some of our deepest scholars who put a lot of time into Africa ain't spent hardly any time studying this culture, because the first rule in war is know yourself. And that ain't just your African past self, it's your African American or new African past and present self as well. So this creative foundation is such because the spirit and reason are combined, and it takes things to a higher level. So when King said, a matter of fact, that we had come up with a successful methodology in the South for breaking down segregation, getting the right to vote, and he kind of just dismissed it as, well, yeah, that's what we did. That's a whole hell of a lot that they did, because they were able to improvise and come up with methods that under normal circumstances would have been impossible, against terrible odds, and come out with a minimum of casualties to achieve those results, as Benny Stewart observed when he was talking about the San Francisco state strike, and why those students who carried out the strike used that methodology as one of their methods. They came up with others as well, suited to their own situation. So the notion of power as being thought that creates who we are at its highest level enables us to uncover cosmic truths that makes the complex simple, the abstract practical, while bringing beauty where there was ugliness. This definition of bringing beauty where there is ugliness, as I pointed out, is stated by most of our artists and everyone else when they express why they do what they do. But it was also the mantra of George Washington Carver. So at this highest plane, our thoughts manifesting who we are, and at our highest plane, enabling us to discover hidden truths of the cosmos that can advance life and make life better for humanity. That doesn't mean it's always used for that purpose. But for this master, George Washington Carver, the greatest scientist of the 20th century, this was the key to his creativity. And in fact, he always said he wanted to be himself. No one was going to take him off his path. He always said, you can't teach anybody anything. Bring out what is within. That is really at the heart and soul of what my book on Seba is about. You understand? So someone coming out of the area of the country, Kansas, where there weren't that many Black people at that time, was more African than just about anybody you could think of, and was drawing from the core tenets of African culture, the centerpiece of which is spirit. So he is the greatest scientist in the 20th century. Why? Because of the extraordinary amount of innovative things that he came up with, inventions in all areas of science. He was the most productive. And he was pursuing his natural gift, which is the gift of healing plants, botany, which, by the way, I pointed this out before, his greatest interest was in painting. He was a master painter. He was an artist. He was a spirit scientist who was an artistic scientist. And that's what should be involved in every endeavor we do. We should be bringing beauty to it. He was so good as a painter, he got a scholarship to one of the best painting schools in the country. He was also a great singer, and he got a scholarship to one of the great conservatories of music. He played the accordion because that was the only instrument he had in the white environment he was living in. You know what I mean? So a painter, a singer, a musician. And his favorite subject for painting was plants. You hear me? But as he said, no sick plant ever died in his hands. He cured every piece of nature that needed healing. And so he understood that the role of science is not to dominate and control, but to heal. That the role of the human being is to help cultivate, tweak science, not control it, and to learn from science, because since spirit is in everything, as George Washington Carver said, his greatest lessons were learned from piping into God's mind through his dreams and getting up at 4 a.m. and communicating with what he called the animates and the inanimates, because those spirits are all wise. Everything that God created is. And so he could create so much more than any other scientist in the 20th century because he was first open to this higher spirit mind. And he could commune with God. And he had learned a lesson from God to be practical. He was asking big questions from God. He wanted to know everything, and God kept telling him it's too big, it's too big. And then finally he said to Peanut, God said, I can help you with that. And that's not the only thing he invented, things from was a peanut. He invented so many things that was funny. You know what I mean? So many. And a part of his creative essence came from his humility. The fact that he was there as a servant. And black farmers who he would go, because he created a special wagon that he carried into the rural South to teach basic agrarian science. And he would sleep in these shacks that poor black people lived in as sharecroppers. And they said of him, when George Washington Carver's coming, God is coming. And let me tell you something, it is a rare black person that will call another human being of any color other than some they have hanging on the wall, God. And George Washington Carver certainly didn't. He was too humble to see himself that way, but they were seeing the creative kind, compassionate, brilliant qualities of George Washington Carver used to uplift black folks and humanity. So his science is based on intuition on various levels and nurturing the gift that he had of healing plants. And so he said, the purpose of his science was to bring beauty where there was ugliness and to make the waste useful and the abstract practical. By the way, that's all a part of the definition that I just gave you. He's the epitome of it. So a lot of us get tired of George Washington Carver because that's all they tell us. No, we have a lot of great scientific inventors, mathematicians, everything else. He just happens to be at the highest level. And the view you got of him is not the view that he had of himself. He represents the highest level of creativity. Now I'm going to use some other examples of how we pipe into this higher mind and come up with cosmic breakthroughs, innovations in various areas of science or math or any other area. And some of these aren't black. I made the point that this definition, to be valid, has to be universal. Like, for example, when the Yoruba say that everyone has a compact in heaven with God and it's called C.O.R.E, he didn't just say African people. That's everybody. But we happen to have a culture that's spirit-based, and so it pipes in to this higher realm. Others have to die to figure it out, or die for a minute on an operating table to come back and share it. And some of us come back and I know question. But the key point is our culture's wired for the higher plane. It's natural. But there are also other people who pipe in to these higher planes. For example, in my own life in the 80s, I went to a spiritual reader, Eric, I don't remember his last name. He was trained in Brazil. He was a white guy, humble and whatnot. And the first time I went as an astrologer, and I go to these astrology bookstores and stuff, and he was giving a lecture, but he was reading people. Some of you know that, some of you don't. And that means he picked up on their vibes and then say things about them that other people didn't know unless they knew them very well. And so he picked up on me, and he picked up on this vibe of twinness, which had been a thing that I had been working on to transform my thought pattern. The notions coming out of Dogon astrophysics and out of African American thought. And I've been reworking my thought pattern from an either or, good or bad thought pattern, to a spiritual, intellectual one that fused the two. And it was a lot of work. And so he picked up on that. And so I went back for detailed reading, and I have this 1982. I listened to it maybe once a year. And he laid out what he saw as the pattern of my life. And it proved to be true. You know what I mean? But it was based on him tuning into this central thing that was transforming me, which was this twin mentality. I told you I went through 15 months of looking at myself, 3 months out of the year, because that was my vacation time. I go by myself, camp out, and look at myself to work the masculine and feminine into a synthesis, because I was strong on the masculine, weak on the feminine. It was a lot of internal work, but I couldn't have done it had it not been for me internalizing the thought pattern that comes out of the Dogon twin system. And their system is twin because positive and negative, masculine and feminine, are not viewed as separate, because inside of us we have both qualities as human beings. But it inclines more to the masculine for the male, more to the feminine towards the female. And so it's reconditioning my thought pattern that enabled me to negotiate this life crisis. And I would say that this twin thought pattern of the sacred and the secular, the spirituals and the blues, when you see that things have more than one side to it, when you're facing a life crisis, you won't go just one way. When you have this attitude, no matter how pessimistic a situation is, there's optimism, you're less likely to even think of committing suicide. But when you are at a point where you have got into this good or bad thought pattern, it's either good or bad, and you think it's bad, you might think about exiting this planet. And I've told you, 7 to 11-year-old young blacks now have a higher suicide rate than whites of that age. And no one should be, considering suicide at that age. And for young blacks to consider that means that a change in mindset has occurred, but also in circumstance where they don't see a future. And at that age, truly tragic. And so we have to change a lot more to alter that mindset. But this idea that everything can change, nothing remains the same. The young become the old, mysteries they do unfold, change. You know what I mean? That's been at the essence of our attitude, our philosophy, our thought pattern, and behavior pattern. But in terms of piping into this higher mind thing, we all have the Spirit of God within us. Some of our cultures, when it comes to humanity, are wired for it. Some are wired against it. And so when we look at breakthroughs in science, mathematics, in all areas, all those breakthroughs require the mastery of technical knowledge, but usually doesn't put those who have that knowledge at the front of the line in their field. But that's the prerequisite. You've got to have the foundation. And then when you have that foundation, when you're open to the intuitive, you can ascend to the higher level. And all innovations, and the greatest innovations are the ones where discoveries are made of truths coming from God that humanity has not known before. So the highest level of creativity isn't really creating it, but it is piping into God's mind, as George Washington Carver said, and bringing it down. And who knows why some people get it and some don't. But in most cases, and certainly in the case of a George Washington Carver, because he was going to do it for good. So when we look at chemistry, organic chemistry, August Kekulé, Kekule, discovered the benzene ring theory, leading him to be the founder of organic chemistry. And how did he discover this? The benzene ring? Through a dream where a snake was biting its tail. And that gave him the pattern for figuring this out. And it gave him the whole answer. And by the way, in each of these areas of innovation, George Washington Carver, no error in his stuff. August Kekulé, no error in his stuff. Only God can do that. You hear me? We make mistakes. If you're just using this logical mind, you get some things right, you get some things wrong. That's why most people who write books got to do the rewrite, because they discover that, well, some of those things they assumed that theory, which is a guess, was wrong. You hear me? Another innovator is a man named Dmitry Mendeleev. He organized the periodic table, where chemical elements are organized based on their atomic or chemical elements, organized based on their atomic properties. The logical mind couldn't give him this answer because it's a whole lot of things you had to put together to come up with the periodic table. He discovered the periodic table when he fell asleep at his desk one night. His dream enabled him to see the complete picture. That was the God mind, the higher mind, the intuitive mind that rests inside of each of us. But you had to know that field. You're not going to just get that, you know. If you did, you wouldn't know what it meant. Niels Bohr was the father of quantum mechanics. He won the Nobel Prize in that field in 1922. He developed the model of the atom, where electrons revolve around the nucleus and can jump from one energy level to the other or orbit to another, a concept without error. He made this discovery in a dream. Shut yourself off from the intuitional level, and you're just a bean counter. You hear me? Because you don't have to be the one that comes up with the breakthrough for some idea. If that spirit is talking to you, it's going to help you, guide you in your life, and to you become a more creative human being. Einstein's theory of relativity came from what he described as a vivid dream. In this dream, he saw himself riding a sled downhill, faster and faster. And he realized this sled was moving at the speed of light. And as he looked up, he could see the stars. And they were refracted in different colors. And he realized this was the most important discovery of his life. Again, a dream. But again, he was a quantum physicist. I could have that dream. It wouldn't mean anything. That ain't my area. You know what I mean? Huh? John Coltrane, an average musician in his beginning, only had one gift, rhythm. But his teacher saw a lot of promise in him. She saw a lot of promise. But musicians didn't see very much for a long time. But what he did was practice 14 hours a day, not only on music, but reading on spiritual texts, reading on astrology, reading on history. Most of these deep musicians and artists we have are real deep thinkers. You know what I mean? But it's after this hard work, apprenticing under some masters, Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk, who really help him develop his self-confidence and be in an environment of excellence that required him to soar higher and higher. And, Miles with his short staccato, magnificent lyrical sound combined with Coltrane, who could go on for an hour and 45 minutes, one song. You know what I mean? That apprenticeship over a long time, combined with his decision to cold turkey drugs and alcohol, 2 weeks of going through painful withdrawal. And at the end of that painful withdrawal, he wakes up one morning and his first wife, Naima, is looking at him and she says, "John, what happened?" He said, "I heard a sound that came from heaven." And you could see he was changed by that experience. Prior to that experience, Coltrane had not become either an improviser or an innovator. An improviser is someone who creates a sound within an existing school. An innovator creates new schools. Only 2% in any field are innovators. Only 2%. And some who say innovate one or two things may stop because of financial considerations or because they just don't have the courage to go any further. Because when you go into new boundaries, there's a very thin line between genius and foolishness. And in music, this new area usually brings in a new sound. And so some people, Black people in particular, will have trouble adapting to it. Dizzy had that problem with bebop. When he go to the South, a lot of Southern Blacks had problems with it because it was fast. It didn't have the blues foundation because at the beginning, Dizzy didn't draw from the blues because he associated it with slavery like some of you do. Some Black people are really confused. They like gospel, but they don't like blues. Well, gospel is nothing but the blues. It's just one's about God, one's about the woman and the man. It's the only difference. Same tone, same everything. You know what I mean? So this caused Dizzy to reach a point where he had to consider how is he going to get some food on the plate. And his wife was telling him that. So he innovated two major innovations in jazz. One, the Afro-Cuban beat with Mario Posa, and then bebop with Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk. And that's the most complex musical innovation in the 20th century. But some people who innovate keep going higher and higher. And Coltrane, by the end of his life, he had innovated 4 schools of music. What started off as an average musician had been transformed through our system for shaping mastery and masters, something that I cover in the book that I'm finishing now, through his own hard work and practice, but most importantly, through the intervention of the mighty spirit. And be sure, one reason he heard this beautiful sound is he had worked for it, but he was one kind person. They called him sweetness. Even when he was on drugs, he didn't lie or steal. His essential nature came through, and that essential nature was goodness. And like George Washington Carver, He sought to bring beauty where there was ugliness. And his favored base for singing, foundation for singing, was the minor blues, which is the church blues. It's got this spiritual, spooky sound. And that was his grounding. And he tried to play the way a preacher would preach. His grandfather was a preacher, come out of North Carolina. You understand? So look what average ascended to with practice, hard work, and the Spirit. You hear me? The mighty Spirit. And look at the name of the song, A Love Supreme. One of the longest jazz compositions ever, and the best-selling, one of the best-selling. And he didn't do it for money. He never played looking at how will this sell. He always did it as a part of his transformation, his growth. Now, I've noted in my own experience with this that my first innovation that comes from the realm of the higher spirit came from a student, 18 or 19-year-old student, a young sister in the 80s, asking me a question that I gave the wrong answer to because I thought I had the right answer. If our culture is so great, why is it got so many holes in it now? You know? And I gave her an answer, and I've told people this before, but I want to repeat this because I want to give you what this means in terms of piping into this higher mind. And so I gave her an answer. I don't even remember the answer. It was so bad. And I went home and I realized I didn't know, because when I gave her the answer, I didn't know because it sounded like a simple question. I really didn't know the answer. I went back to class, apologized for giving the wrong answer, but I felt bad for not knowing the answer. That was a real problem. I didn't intentionally give the wrong one, but I didn't know, you know. And I told people before, I was sitting in my home, I was living in Richmond then, James Baldwin was on, he had since passed away at that time, and he was saying, since the late 60s, powerful hostile forces hit the Black community, and that clicked immediately. And he said that the Black community wasn't prepared for it. And I'm sitting in my study one night asking what happened in humility. And whenever I've experienced this transcendence, this thinking God's thoughts, it's been when I've had a big question, I've been humble. I know I don't have the answer and I'm asking for help, and don't expect to get it either, you know. And it's when I saw this light, because for me, the intuitive realm comes through the light. Now I have intuition like most people, and there's certain things I can sense like a lot of people, but this is breakthrough level for me. And so when I saw this light, after asking what happened, without speaking, because the light is telepathic, communicates without talk, it said a choice between two cultures. Meaning the forces, I've talked about this before, and it's summarized in my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by choice between two cultures. It meant that the forces that had hit Black communities that weakened Black families, that weakened Black extended family communities, that led to the prison industrial complex, drugs, deindustrialization, whatnot, that these had put our people in a position unconsciously of choosing between their rich African-American culture and this mad Aryan European American culture, often without knowing it. So choice doesn't mean always conscious. And especially with the youth not always knowing what this rich culture they were drawing from was, and how serious it was and deadly it was to depart from it. So by piping into this higher mind, being fortunate that God visited me with this beautiful light, then I got a whole answer to a whole problem. It defined the real problem. It wasn't just drugs, it was the culture of what was hitting us that was the problem. Of course, we know drugs is a culture. When you become an addict, it becomes a culture. But so are corporate values. That's a culture. Individualism to the point where the individual matters more than the group. That's a culture. Materialism, where material things matter more than human beings. That's a deadly culture, you know? So the answer that God gave me, I wouldn't have come up with on my own because it defined the real nature of the problem and the solution at the same time. It was within all these things that hit us, it gave a totality. As I call it, within anything was everything. And so in any approach to organizing, to heal our communities, heal our people, the deepest part of our culture has to be tied in with economic, political, social, and other things, you know. The people who have read this book from all levels of life, and this book's been out since 2005, whether they're organizers, whether they're teachers, whether they're parents, whether they're young, whether they're old, they will all say this. It's a choice between two cultures, brother. And I have to say in all humility, that came through me. Those are God's words. Those aren't mine. You know what I mean? My second experience with this, being able to take things and get a piece of the cosmos that can help us in bringing justice on this earth. And by the way, I think this is the whole task for us as a people, is to take the best of our culture to transform this reality, to Africanize it. You know? That's our real task here, you know. And so I've noted before that after going through 15 months of retreats to work on the fact that, well, my wife had experienced, my first wife, mental illness, and I sent her to a psychiatrist after getting advice because I didn't know the first thing of what you do to help people with that. And my realization that I had a problem, and my problem was that I didn't know she had one. And I've been living with her for 16 years then. So I knew I had a problem. And being an astrologer, I knew where it came from. Strong on the masculine, weak on the feminine. I knew. You know what I mean? And so I could have gone to a psychiatrist, ain't nothing wrong with that, get counseling. I decided to go into the woods, you know, pitch me a tent or just get me a sleeping bag, lay out 3 months by myself and look at myself for 5 years. And using that spiritual blues, using core principles coming out of Dogon and Kemetic thought and other African thought systems, using that philosophy to work out a rebalancing of myself. And so after that work, I began working on the mother principle. At the same time, we're doing a retreat for Black studies to redefine the discipline. At the same time, we're carrying out a war to get African-centered curriculum into the public schools that I'm leading for the National Black United Front. We're doing the same thing in Oakland. There's a bunch of things at the same time, you know. But I could do it better because now I had worked out some internal synthesis. I hadn't anywhere got to where I need to be, but I was a lot better. And so I'm writing this book. I've told people this before, but again, I want you to get the real meaning of this and the context of this discussion. And so I wrote 180 pages. I asked myself, what did the Dogon mean by the just society, since I was heavily drawing from them? And I realized I didn't know. I was in trouble again. Sitting in my study one night asking, what did the Dogon mean by the just society? And I see this beautiful white light, the most beautiful experience of my life. And by the way, I've pointed this out before, those who have gone to the highest plane, the greatest holy man, among the Lakota people, His name was Fool's Crow. He lived to about 98 years of age and was in good health right up to his death almost. He would do astral projections where his spirit would leave his body, and he actually would go out for 5-6 days. Most people whose spirits leave their body, it's only for in dreams when they're asleep. Some can do it when they're awake, but not that long, because if the spirit doesn't come back, you're dead. And he's in the heavenly realm. And in the heavenly realm, you're outside of space, outside of time. So you can learn in 3 seconds what would probably take 10 years on Earth. So he's taken 5, 6, 7 days. Those are some lessons he's learning. And he was a healer, a great healer. Some say he was the greatest healer among the Lakota people. Where he would go, because of his spirit being so high, he went to the highest heaven. There are many heavens. And he saw God. And what was God? A great white light. A great white light. And I know this light that I saw, I knew was God. Unconditional love, all embracing, beauty beyond description, peace. And I'm a peaceful internally. I have peace. I don't have discord. A peace I had never experienced, a humility, a kindness, It changed me. People who were really observant afterwards, one in particular, Janae Johnson, she's going to watch this, mention your name, girl. She said, before, when I was in that rough warrior stage, you were unapproachable, because I had that look. I wasn't that way, but that's how I looked. But afterwards, she says, you're approachable like Asa Hilliard, because Asa was one kind brother, But it changed me. It changed me, And I've seen death. It's beautiful, as long as you're doing right. Now that other side, you don't want to go there. So what did the Spirit say? I've told some people this before, others don't. It's the basis for the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. Dr. Obenga describes this book as a classic and says that my term for African families, which the light gave me, should be in the dictionary. It's my best work. It took 15 disciplines to master this vision, and I am not a master of 15 disciplines. So I had some scientists who were helping me and different people giving me stuff so that I could see the different sides of this truth. And so the answer coming from God, when I'm asking, what's the basis, the secret basis of just societies of Africa? The answer was, it was those societies where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And I knew instantly that was the Trois. You see my emphasis on the Trois. It came from the vision. There was a balance between males and females. There was no oppression of men over women, of the strong over the weak, the young over the old. They lived in balance, and they lived in that state for 100,000 years. You hear me? And it led me to then appreciate what is the foundation for African culture. We start with Kemet. We need to start with the foundation. And then, as I pointed out in a couple of series on the Anu, who are agrarian Trois because they give birth to agriculture, the Anu are the founders of Kemet. The Trois gave birth to the greatest classical civilization, but they're the people that brought civilization to the world. And so, of all the discoveries that I could ever come up with, the one that I'd be most grateful for is the one that offered a formula for creating just societies. And if you've got imagination, you can figure this out. So I call this not matriarchy, where women ruled, not patriarchy, where men ruled, not patrilineal, even though the last name may come from the father, not matrilineal, even though the last name may come from the mother. But I called it twin lineal, meaning your lineage, what you're descended from. You're descended from both male and female, mother and father, grandmother, grandfather. And if God is he, God is she, God is neither, God is spirit. But if you're going to conceive it as one, it's got to be the other. And so getting this piece of the truth, I could have never got on my own. It was because it's taking what is complex and making it real simple. And I say it's the basis for reconfiguring society, because there's a question up here: what did I think of Marxism and African studies? I always say I'm not anti-Marxist. Anyone that wants to create something better, and in this case, redistribute wealth, that's good. The problem is the Marxists are coming from the same philosophical worldview with modifications as the rest of Europe or Aryans do. And so they've got this dictatorship of the proletariat, which means the working class should rule, but has come to mean those who run the party run everything. You know what I mean? But the key point is it's very difficult to get justice if you don't have a formula for just distribution of power, if you don't have a formula for transforming the human being from unjust to just. And that requires a masculine feminine synthesis. It requires removing yourself from the despiritualized notion expressed by Lenin. There can be no revolutionary movement without a revolutionary theory. Revolutionary theory is a guess. And so you're going to base your revolution on that. You hear me? Huh? It takes a whole lot more to make a real revolution, because we can see with the failure of this Russian revolution that there were things that were inadequate. Theory minus spirit is going to lead you into a place where you could have a party that brought down terror on the heads of the people. You hear me? For the purpose of control, and not to even go after their enemies who are trying to overthrow the revolution, but to go after anyone that challenged their power, right or wrong, So we got to think outside these Aryan boxes and draw from the best of our past to construct something that will bring beauty to the world. So in conclusion, creating free space inside ourselves is where power begins. Free thoughts that are based on the highest thoughts, despiritualizing works against it, and we have to see that there's a balance between the spirit and reason, and we have to see that we're guided by this higher mind. Balance is the key to internal harmony and creativity, and that balance on all levels, because that's what we have to work on, not just one thing, even if it's a good thing. So our intuitive thoughts create who we are, and our logical thoughts execute that vision. So let your highest truthful thoughts embody your truest dreams and wishes and empower you to be your true self. That's it. Hope you got something out of this. I think one of my people here got a sense that this was going to go this period of time. So I hope you note here that we have a new thing underneath the picture that is advertising the show, and also where you can make donations to Venmo or Cash App, Dr. Obatashaka's show. So one of the things that I've been stressing before is that we need some donations to help us cover some cost. I put about $25,000 of my own money into this show, and I can't keep doing that. So I need some help, and this will go into us making the show better. So I hope people will donate. But the main thing is hit the subscriber button. So let me see here. Brother Shabazz, he says, Anthropologists sometimes call that balance between male and female power a diarchy. Okay. Um, yeah. Let's see what else we have here. Brother Spencer W. Smith is thinking about this point of caught between two cultures, sometimes unconsciously, something to think about. Yeah, as one of the students that I spoke to, junior college here, Laney College, said a few years ago, and in fact, that presentation is up on my site. That student said, how can we make a choice between two cultures when we don't even know we have a culture? Good point. Some of us think our culture was destroyed in slavery. So, we think that we don't have anything to draw from, and what we need to do is to examine this culture of ours with the same intensity that those of us who are conscious examine ancient African culture. And the truth is that Africans in America have never done an assessment of our culture. It's one we need. And look at the positives and work on the negatives. LaShonda Henderson, and glad to see you, sister. A good point, Baba. The high rates do point out that a mind change has happened for 7 to 11-year-olds. We need new, or rather reintroduction of mind training for them. Yeah, and some love. And we also need to be working to improve the conditions that surround them. Because if they're coming out of conditions where they see a lot of death, that also promotes the idea that there's no future. And then if their values have been oriented to materialistic ones and they don't see any way to improve themselves on the financial plane, not that at 7 years old they're prepared to, but they just see hopelessness in their future, this is one out. Kamari, Brother Kamari, I really appreciate all the stuff you share with me and you and your wife's presence on this show. This is his comment. And I know in previous lectures you advised the Europeans ethos was control, while the Africans is creativity. Yeah, that becomes real clear when you go beyond just what we call white supremacy or racism, which has also been used for that purpose. But it is the ethos, it's a driving feature of European cultures. But they can only get away with it when they had techniques. And we didn't have it at that level, which is gunpowder and other forms of technology. Oh, Freedom. Yeah, Sun Temple. I love this song. Yeah, so do I. That was a major song of the Black Freedom Movement. James Pooh, your heart is the child in you. What was her desire? Your mind is just a calculator, a powerful machine. Well put, James Pooh. Well put. Yeah, because the child is in tune with who they are, and they get talked out of it through mumbo jumbo coming from older people and trying to please other people. Whole lot of things that people waste their time listening to. One of the biggest mistakes people can make in life is centering their life around pleasing others. It's all right to help others, but make sure what you're doing for other people doesn't work against you. Make sure that you're not doing things that are not meeting the desires of your heart. And to be pushed off into those directions out of trying to please others is a path to misery. And too many of us do that. And that's not just a Black thing, that's a human thing that Black people and other people can get caught in doing as well. Person here said, put your foot in it, the spirit. Yeah. Call it the good foot, huh? James Pooh. To pimp a people, you have to turn off their hearts. They become zombies, calculators, professionals, slaves, um, minds driven by pimps, carrots, and sticks. Well put. And you become a prostitute too. You know what I mean? In the name of that. And as unhappy as all hell. You know what I mean? Yeah, good point. James Pooh, manifestation. Spiritual, he puts desire. Logical, idea. Social, action. Physical, things. Well put. That's some heavy stuff there, brother. Brother Shabazz, I would love to hear your take on the Marxist influence on Black Africana studies. Um, there are few Africana, well, not Africana studies, but Black studies departments that have been led by Marxists, a few, very few. And so they have taken them in that direction. And some of them have some good features. Some of them are engaged in the community and consider themselves to be radical, but they're limited because they're still coming out of this old view. But I respect the fact that they want to see fundamental transformation in the society. Um, they would do much better if they had a deeper appreciation of their own history and culture. Most of the Marxists in the East, that is in Asia, are nationalists. And so Ho Chi Minh, his nationalism came first, which was Confucianism, by the way, you know. James Pooh, linear logics integrate physical, logical, and social experience. Circular logics integrate um, physical, logical, social, and spiritual insights. Linearity produces knowledge, circularity produces wisdom. Yeah, and sometimes inaccurate knowledge. And also, linearity it produces hierarchy. So the ones on the top uh, putting themselves in a position where they think they have the right to dictate to those below. Plato's Republic was based on that principle. It wasn't based on Ma'at. It was based on hierarchy. And the ones at the highest level were the philosophers. And these were not philosopher kings. These were not spirit people because the Greeks prided themselves in taking spirit out of their philosophy, out of their science. So it's really more the power that was key, and everybody in their place. Do what you're told. Again, Kamari, sorry for being late to class, Baba. By the way, I'm ordering some of those books that you had up there. I got to read them, you know. June Marshall. Inyami Nua Na Mawu. Good news, good God never dies, therefore I cannot die. Life after death. Yeah, true. We're eternal. And to the extent that our mission and path in life, the truths that shape us are eternal, are what we leave will be eternal. Ogawa, you like that mouse thing, I see. Yeah, one of the things I'd like to encourage people to do is post this show. Brother Ogawa had suggested this as one strategy to get more of our viewers who, in the case of Facebook, have signed up as Facebook friends to get them, more of them engaged in the show on a regular basis. And so the more of you who can paste up this show and give it to others, the better, you know. Francine Leonard had asked for a repeat of Huey Newton's definition of power. And so that was, power is the ability to define phenomena, and secondly, to make these phenomena act in a desired manner. That's certainly the way white people have exercised their power. Francine Leonard, an Argentinian general, outfitted himself with African soldiers to help Chile. Chile was losing their battle against the Spaniards. Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Black Botron Reloaded, and thanks for being so consistent and supporting this show. And LaShonda Henderson, thanks for tweeting the link to the show. Oh, nice. Tianja Bean. Greetings, Dr. Obutashaka from the island country of Bermuda. Right on. Hey, make sure you subscribe and encourage your countrymen and women to subscribe. That's nice, you know. You know, my wife is from Barbados, probably. See if there's anything else on the bottom here. Brother Shabazz, he agrees with this point. He said, crucial point about examining African American culture as a component of Afrocentricity. Yeah, don't leave yourself out. Nathaniel Turner, how does a Black individual who lives in a mostly white town engage spiritually? Good question. I mean, I was raised in a white environment for most of my young life, from 7 until 18 or 19. So I know what that is that you're asking. Expose yourself as much as you can to African spirituality. So I would say, for example, I don't know what you're interested in, but check out some of the ideas that come out of, say, Yoruba, African spirituality. Read material on Kemetic spirituality or Egyptian. And one that I would recommend is Dr. Jacob Carruthers' Medu Neter, his masterwork. Read some stuff on voodoo, as it's been experienced or practiced in the Caribbean, Haiti, but also in the United States. Read Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston, which is her best work, and it explores voodoo as was practiced in Louisiana. Work on some self-cultivation stuff you can do yourself, whether it's meditation or other things. There are a lot of different ways for you to commune with yourself. And of course, listen to some good music. You know what I mean? Spencer Smith, I appreciate your reference to the great jazz musicians Coltrane, Monk, Davis, along with the great writer James Baldwin. Yeah, and the writers and the musicians and the other creative artists, they are manifestations of this rich culture. They've just taken it to a very high level. See if there's anything else here. Okay, that's it. All right, thank you. I hope you got something out of this. Little short presentation here. So I love you all, enjoy you, and I hope you all make some donations here, because I'm not really interested in going for ads from the corporate people. I'd like to build this show on just our support. I put out some resources. I could use some help. So thank you, and thank you to all the people that have worked to really build the show. Thank you. Hotep.